All right, good morning. Today we are going to talk about emotional regulation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your morning to spend with me. Got about an hour, maybe less, depending on how quickly I can articulate this information to you. Um, if you would like to participate in the post survey, which is just a way for you to give me your feedback on this training and ideas for future trainings, please put your email address in the chat box and I will send you that survey after our time today. These trainings are recorded, so if you want to rewatch this or share it with somebody, the link to do so will be available early next week on YouTube, and it'll also be posted on our website, alabamarespite.org. If you have any questions during the training, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will have some time afterward to get to them. We can have a conversation. Of course, if you start talking during the training, your little name and your face will pop up and it will be on the recording. So if you don't want that to happen, then just add it into the chat and we can have that talk later. Of course, if you want to be on the YouTube, you're more than welcome to join me. It doesn't bother me one bit. All right, so I do have a lot of information today. I hope it serves you well. Some of you, it may just be a recap. Some of you, this may be brand new information. Either way, I'm glad you're here. So the agenda for today is we're going to define emotional regulation. And we're going to talk about this in the context of helping to manage some overwhelm and some of the meltdowns that can happen with an autism diagnosis. But we're also going to talk a little bit about just the brain and how it all works. So we're going to talk about the escalation cycle, de-escalation strategies. That's going to be a good portion of my information today. Some self-regulation for caregivers, and then I'm going to try to summarize it with some important takeaways. All right, so what is emotional regulation? Well, it's defined as a person's ability to effectively manage and respond to an emotional experience. Okay, a lot of times we think of emotional regulation as just kind of keeping our emotions in, right? Not expressing the emotion. And that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about how can we manage them in a way that's healthy and informed, okay? So there's really not a surefire way to regulate anyone's emotions when you're overwhelmed, especially if you're parenting a child with sensory overload, autism, sensory processing disorder, even ADHD. You may find this. But this can definitely lead to some emotional struggles for the kiddos that are on the spectrum or that have these diagnoses, okay? And so situations often leading to anger, frustration, or meltdowns can be soothed with emotional regulation. And we have to understand what's causing the emotions, okay? So education in this capacity is, I think, a great seed for compassion, because when you understand what's going on within the system of your child, you can start to see some of these behaviors a little differently and be able to respond more effectively and more compassionately. So let's talk about the escalation cycle. Okay, once you understand this cycle, and you can allow the people in your space to understand this cycle, then the meltdowns, the behaviors, the emotional dysregulation can start being seen for what it is rather than behavior issues that need discipline necessarily. Okay, so meltdowns might seem unpredictable or kind of like they just show up out of nowhere. There's a clear pattern that happens before, after, and during a meltdown. And once we understand those patterns, it's much easier to be successful preventing that meltdown, okay? So we have to identify early warning signs and know how to intervene. Identify environmental factors that can trigger meltdowns, right? And understand how to shift those or manipulate those. And plan and teach replacement behaviors that more effectively communicate needs than the behaviors are, because that's really what's happening, okay? Your kiddo is butting up against an unmet need in some way, whether that's just the discomfort of the environment or, their clothes are weird or whatever. And they're communicating that to you through the behavior. Okay. Whether your child is verbal or nonverbal, every child, every person has nonverbal communication. And a lot of these behaviors are that. Okay. So this diagram that you see on the screen here, this is a representation of kind of what happens to a person's emotional state as a meltdown occurs. Okay. So we've got the calm, and then the trigger, the agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and then the post-crisis depletion and recovery. We're going to go over each of those. So after a trigger, your child is no longer in that calm state, right? Another word we can use instead of trigger is activation, okay? Because that's really the nervous system is being activated. So the trigger is the turning point that could lead to a meltdown, depending on what happens next, okay? So at this point, your child's sympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk about later, is activated, okay? The sympathetic nervous system is kind of that place where your body recognizes threat, okay? And many automatic changes kind of happen in the body at this place, okay? And when I say automatic, what I mean is they're not necessarily something that they can control, okay? It's not happening on purpose. They're not intentionally saying, I'm activated, I'm going to activate myself, I'm going to be agitated now, okay? It's just something that happens automatically, okay? So if you realize that and you intervene at the trigger point, then there's like an 80 to 90% chance that you can prevent that situation from escalating into a full-blown meltdown, okay? And this is why caregivers understanding this component can be incredibly proactive by being just aware, right? You know your kiddo better than anybody else, right? So you can kind of, I'm sure some of you are already kind of thinking like, yep, I know what my kids' triggers are. I know what my triggers are, right? And some of you may need to do a little bit of investigating, and that's okay, right? Now you know what you're looking for. So during that agitation, okay, the trigger happens, then they start to get agitated. That's when you intervene, okay? So once your child reaches that state of agitation, you're going to start seeing an increase in those challenging behaviors, right? So if you intervene successfully, now you may have a 30 to 40% chance of preventing that situation, okay? So if you intervene at the trigger, you have a better chance of avoiding the meltdown altogether. But if you intervene at the agitation, you've got a 30 to 40% chance of avoiding it, okay? So during this stage, you might notice things like an inability to stay on task, right? They're very distracted. Then maybe they're becoming oppositional. Maybe they're starting to whine or complain or talk back to you, right? You can tell they are definitely agitated, right? They may increase their stimming behaviors, right? Or their body movements. That's a way for them to try to regulate or try to get that energy moving, right? They may start to resist transitions. No, I'm not getting into the car. No, I'm not using the restroom. No, I'm not going to sit down and eat, right? Withdraw, right? They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to look at you. They're going to avoid you completely, right? And so this kind of is your last chance to intervene to avoid that or prevent that meltdown, okay? So if you don't catch it at the trigger and you don't catch it at the agitation, we're going to start moving into that acceleration phase, okay? So escalation will run its course at this point, okay? So if you haven't caught it in the very beginning and that acceleration happens, you're just going to have to let it be what it is, okay? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So once your child has reached that point of acceleration, the escalation of the meltdown will most likely just have to run its course. And so if you understand that at this point, you know that your child has pretty much lost control of their behavior, okay? And this is unfortunately where people start to want to implement discipline. Now, for a typical child, maybe that's appropriate, right? But for a child on the spectrum or a child who has sensory processing needs, there is no control here, okay? So you can discipline all you want to, but it's not going to do anything but make things worse, okay? So this is an autonomous nervous system response, okay? Not a conscious choice they're making to misbehave, okay? So this is where compassion really is going to be your best friend. Okay, not just towards your child, but even towards yourself, right? Because probably at this point you're like, good grief, I'm about to lose it myself, right? So what does the meltdown look like? So it'll be different for everybody, okay? But many of the same behaviors kind of find their way in. So that could look like hitting, spitting, running off, or what we call eloping. They might start to bite or get more aggressive. They may start behaving in destructive behaviors, right? They're just trashing anything they can get their hands on, screaming, right? So at this point, maintaining everyone's safety, of course, is the most important thing. You don't want to just let your kids run off like a Tasmanian devil and, fly out into the road and get hurt, right? We want to let it run its course. We want to make sure everyone's safe while that's happening, okay? Again, it is critical to understand that this meltdown is not intentional misbehavior. It's not them trying to manipulate you to get their way. And it's not something that your child is even choosing to control or not control, okay? So telling them to stop or threatening them or enforcing punishments or consequences is only going to add fuel to the fire, okay? They can't help it. So once that acceleration starts to grow into the peak, this is going to be the most severe part of that meltdown, okay? So we want to continue the same way that we were during the acceleration, being calm and focusing on safety, okay? We're going to get into more details in the next slides. After the peak, the deceleration happens, or that de-escalation happens. And this is the point where the behavior becomes less and less severe, okay? And they're going to kind of go, it's just going to peak and then it's going to drop off, okay? And they're going to go into that recovery period. So when your child reaches that state of depletion, they're going to feel drained, right? Their body has just taken control and just let it all out, right? They're going to be tired. They're going to be very, very tired and depleted, okay? And so during this time, we want to focus on reestablishing their routine and starting new, okay? So we don't want to nag, blame, punish, or force apologies in this time, okay? They're recovering from a very, very stressful event, and I would wager so are you, right? Nobody really, wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait for my next, the next moment my kid loses control, right? So it's stressful for everybody. So what's happening? As the body begins relaxing, that prefrontal cortex in our brain, the part where all of our good decision making and our logic and our emotional processing skills, okay, that starts to come back online. During that peak, during that acceleration, either that part of the brain is not in the driver's seat, okay? It is all survival brain. It's all amygdala. We're going to talk about that too. So this reactivation is very important. It means that your child will be better able to think clearly and make choices, communicate, and regulate their emotion, okay? So recovery can take about 20 to 60 minutes for a child who has occasional meltdowns, but for the kiddos who experience frequent or prolonged stress, it can take several hours or even days before they return back to a fully calm baseline state. Okay, so if you've ever noticed where you've had like a really, really hard day with your kiddo and they've been struggling and you've been struggling and they have the couple meltdowns, they still might feel a little off in the morning. And you're like, I wonder why? Well, because the body is still recovering from that extremely stressful event. Okay, so after recovery, after everyone's kind of calmed down, you can go ahead and talk to your kiddo about what happened, right? We're not saying that there is no place for conversation or even consequences depending on the situation. But it's just not going to be during that time where their brain just really isn't in a place to even metabolize that information. Okay. So when it's appropriate, we want to talk about it. If there are consequences that need to be doled out, we do that. But we want to explain why, and we want to talk about expected behavior, right? And so we want to work on teaching replacement behaviors and practice calming activities. And we'll get into that too. So you can say like, hey, when you start to feel this way, maybe we can start breathing, right? So, you'll have a toolbox of what you can kind of pull out and teach your child afterward. Okay, so let's get into the brain. This is probably my most favorite part, but I understand not everybody is, into the neuroscience like I am. So I'll try to make this short and sweet. But But the most common signs, again, that someone might be getting close to a meltdown is that increased agitation, distress, difficulty with communicating and regulating their emotions, right? Physical sensations can also take place, right? They may have tension, right, in their shoulders, in their jaw, wherever. Trouble breathing, okay? Maybe they can't catch their breath. Maybe they're feeling hot, right? Their hands are getting hot, their face is getting hot. They may even have things like blurry vision, right? We've all kind of been in this space before, maybe not as intense as some of the kiddos, but you know, where we are kind of activated and we can tell our threat response is kicking in, right? So those same sensations that you're familiar with, you know, look for those in your kiddo as well. And being aware of those signs and offering support can really help during those moments, okay? It is very important that we understand, though, the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum. Okay, just because your child has, you know, sensory needs or processing disorders doesn't mean that they are incapable of having tantrums. Okay, they are still children and tantrums do still occur, but we need to know the difference. Okay, not every meltdown is a tantrum and not every tantrum is a meltdown. Okay, so we want to respond with care and understanding. Okay. We want to create safe spaces where they can feel supported as they navigate the overwhelm. And in the next sections, we're going to talk about how to do that as well. Okay. But here we've got the brain. So we've got the forebrain. That's the prefrontal cortex. Okay. That is where our thinking happens. Okay. That's the executive function part. That's the reasoning, the problem solving, all of that. And so when we're regulated, the forebrain is engaged and ready to learn, right? We can be curious, we can be open, we're ready to get new information. And then there's the midbrain. So this is what we call the limbic system, excuse me. So this is the feeling part of the brain where our emotions are experienced. And so when it's engaged, there's less connection with that forebrain, okay? So your child may seem emotional, needy, demanding, uncooperative, nervous, okay, that kind of thing. And so we help them to regulate their emotions. And then the hindbrain, this is the brainstem and the amygdala. So this is the survival part of the brain. This is what controls that fight or flight instinct, right? It senses danger, becomes activated, and tries to protect itself, okay? So when this is engaged, there is no connection to the forebrain, okay? So all that thinking, all that reasoning, all that problem solving, it's out the window, okay? So when the hindbrain is in control, the forebrain is on mute, okay? So your kiddo may hit, bite, scream, spit, run away, shut down, okay? It's because they're not feeling safe for whatever reason, okay? That overwhelm, that sensory overload, that kind of stuff, that's what kicks this hindbrain into action. And we cannot teach or discipline, okay? There is a barrier between them being able to understand what they're being disciplined for and what they're experiencing. Okay, so if you add discipline in this space, they're just going to perceive more threat and it's going to make things more activated. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system, this is kind of what activates. Okay, it is a network of nerves that function as our body's built-in alarm system. Everybody has this, okay, not just kiddos on the spectrum. Okay, its activity increases when we feel stressed, when we feel like we're in danger, whether that's real or perceived danger, and when we're physically active. So this is the system that controls that fight or flight instinct. So it's important to understand the sympathetic nervous system if we want to understand what's taking place when our kids are emotionally regulated or dysregulated and having a meltdown, okay? So how does this work? Anytime that you or your child are in a stressful or threatening situation, the sympathetic nervous system activates. So remember, this is not something we have conscious control over. We can't just say system activate, right? That doesn't happen. Telling ourselves we're safe doesn't always stop that automatic response, okay? Once it's activated, you know, we just kind of have to deal with it as it is, right? That's when we start using those coping skills and we start to, you know, do the things that are going to kind of shift our activation off, okay? So when faced with stress or danger, the region in the brain called the hypothalamus activates, okay? and it activates that system. It's basically like your brain saying, okay, this might not be safe, or this is really stressful, I don't know how to handle it, right? And it kind of pushes a panic button, okay? And a rapid release of cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. Okay, those are our stress hormones, and it signals that it's time to prepare for a potential threat. Okay, so many things can trigger the activation of the system. It really all depends on the person, but it could be a sudden loud noise, yelling, unexpected events, or a change in routine. Okay, unfamiliar environments, doing something that's new and challenging. These are just a few common triggers, but it can be anything stressful. Okay, so if you as an adult who maybe doesn't have sensory processing can identify with this activation, it's so much more intense for someone who has sensory processing problems, right? Especially if you're a kiddo and you're still learning your own emotions and you're learning the world around you, right? It can be very, very stressful. Then there's the transmission of signals. So the activation sends that message down your spinal cord to other parts of the body. And it's your nervous system's way of distributing kind of orders quickly and efficiently, right? Like all hands on deck, there's a threat, we got to work. We got to work together and we got to do it quick, right? So as soon as that message is sent, those physiological changes happen in the body, okay? So the physical responses once the message is received could be your heart rate starts to increase. This is pumping blood to muscles and vital organs, right? Your body's gearing up to protect itself. Your breathing can accelerate, right? That enhances the oxygen intake that you're going to need if you have to run away or fight something. Pupils will start to dilate as a way to allow for better vision. So if we're facing a predator or we're facing a threat, we're going to be able to see in a way that helps us to strategize and fight. Muscles will start to get tense, priming for action. Okay, and a lot of us experience this chronic stress as this chronic activation with really, really tight, intense, like jaw muscles and shoulders, right? It's our body activating to protect ourselves. Okay, this is all part of that fight or flight response, and it's automatic in preparing you to either confront the threat, fight, or escape, flee. Okay, flight. So in the brain, a lot of changes occur when that sympathetic nervous system is activated. We got those stress hormones flooding. We've got the prefrontal cortex kind of shutting down, right? Planning, decision making, problem solving, impulse control, logic, those are all kind of muted at that point, right? And so you can even think about yourself when you're chronically stressed. What are you feeling? Brain fog, right? You can't remember things like you used to. You don't really feel like problem solving or game planning, or you're looking at your grocery list and you would rather jump out the window than have to deal with anything like that, right? Those are kind of what happens when we're chronically stressed, right? It's because that system is activated, and it can happen chronically over time, or it can happen in one moment, right? So your kiddo, of course, will find it significantly more challenging to find the words to describe their thoughts and their feelings and what triggered them. And they may even become nonverbal in this time, right? Because they can't think about it. Your kiddo will not respond to logic. They will not respond to reasoning or even potential consequences of their behavior if you try to communicate with them during this time, right? If you don't stop, you're going to get A, B, or C. You're not going to be able to do this thing, right? They can't even hear it. Okay, so it's very helpful to remember that if your child isn't listening to you when they're dysregulated, it's not a conscious choice that they're making to be difficult. Okay, it's an automatic response happening in their brain. And so the more immediate and severe the threat appears to them, the more significantly that prefrontal cortex will be impacted and start to kind of become muted. Okay. After this, the resolution and recovery, after it peaks and starts to decelerate, we got 20 to 60 minutes after the threat has passed, or the perceived threat has passed, and the body starts to normalize and recover from the fight or flight state. So this is where the sympathetic nervous system's counterpart, the parasympathetic nervous system, takes over, okay? And a lot of the tools that are useful in this state where they're activated is going to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? I know it's a lot of words, but hopefully you're following me okay. Okay. So we understand the fight or flight. We know that it's automatic. We know it's just a survival response of our nervous system. So what does that look like in our kiddos? I kind of touched on a little bit in the last one, but we're going to go through a little bit more for the kiddos who are on the spectrum, okay? Fight or flight is a survival mechanism, but in modern settings, these responses manifest as behaviors rather than literally fighting or literally fleeing, okay? Now, some of your kiddos will literally fight you and they will literally run from you, okay? But understanding some of the nuances can definitely help you respond more effectively to their needs during stressful moments, okay? So fight, again, aggression, literally fighting you, hitting, kicking, biting, shouting, right? They're really ready to get in the ring with you, okay? But it can also look like defiance, right? I'm not going to do these things. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to follow instructions, right? I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to talk back, okay? That's not just them being a little butthead, okay? They are in a space where their brain is perceiving threat for some reason, okay? It can also look like destroying, breaking toys, throwing objects, causing damage to their surroundings, okay? Sometimes even little ones will, try to hurt themselves in this space, okay? They're in fight mode. And flight, okay? So this can definitely be physically leaving the room. It could be eloping. It could be running away from you, okay? But they're trying to, it's like kind of those avoidance behaviors, right? Hiding, or even just engaging in activities that distract them from the stressor, right? They're feeling, very kind of obsessive over one thing because they're feeling dysregulated. And so they're trying to soothe themselves through distraction. Social withdrawal or becoming unusually quiet, maybe even covering their face, right? It could also look like rushing through tasks, okay? Hurrying to finish a task or skipping them altogether can also be a form of flight behavior, attempting to move past the source of stress quickly. So I know for my kiddos, they're a little older, that flight response can look like them rushing through things that they're just really not wanting to do. Like my kiddos get really like sensory ick when they have to clean the kitchen. And so they just kind of rush through it real quick. And, from the outside looking in, it can look like they're just being lazy or they're not, putting a lot of effort into it. But I understand that neurobiologically, they might just be so overwhelmed that they're in flight mode and they're just trying to get out of the environment as quickly as possible. Okay. But you know your kiddo best, so you can, determine what's them just kind of trying to shirk on their responsibilities and what is something that they're really struggling with, okay? But that's how it can show up in young ones. So some causes, okay, or some triggers. So experiencing these meltdowns can be really challenging for individuals on the spectrum, as well as you as their caregiver, right? We never want to see our young ones or our loved ones being in distress, right? So that's why it's really important to understand the triggers and the causes behind the meltdown so that we can help develop effective prevention strategies, right? And that can make everybody's journey a lot more easy, okay, as we go through, as we navigate it. Some common factors that often contribute to the meltdowns include sensory overload, change in routine, and emotional stressors, okay? So we're going to go through one by one. A sensory overload. Many autistic individuals face difficulties processing sensory information, which leads to sensory overload. So that means when the brain is taking in the information, it gets processed, we make meaning of it, and then we respond. If you have a hard time processing, you're going to have a hard time knowing how to respond, okay? And it can become very overwhelming. So overwhelming sounds, bright lights, strong smells, being in crowded environments, that can feel intrusive and it can also feel kind of threatening, right? There's this thing that's bothering me that I can't escape from it, right? And that creates a lot of stress, and that is what results in those meltdowns, okay? So it's very important to recognize these challenges and be patient while we support them through these moments, okay? Changes in routine, okay? Have you noticed that maybe when your kiddo gets off the bus after school, and you say, okay, go put your homework down or go do this. You give them a few little things to do, and they haven't had, like, as soon as they walk in the door, and they may have a hard time with that. They might start to feel a little agitated. They might start to get a little defiant, okay? It's because that transition from school to home, they need a little bit of a buffer, right? That could be something they're experiencing, difficulty in changing that routine, changing that transition. Okay, so many individuals on the spectrum, routines can provide a sense of security and comfort. And when those routines are disrupted, it can lead to feelings of anxiety and distress. Okay, so activity transitions from one to another or any expected change can feel daunting. Okay, they expect every day they're going to come home, they're going to have their snack, they're going to watch their show, and then they're going to be able to, start a homework. And then instead they get home and you say, well, we don't have time for a snack. We got to run to grandma's and we have to do this and this and that and the other. They're not expecting it. And they may have that friction there, right? So as caregivers, maintaining that consistent routine and offering support during transitions can really make a difference in your kiddo's ability to cope with that change, okay? It's not that they can't cope with it. They just maybe need a little bit of time so that they can process the new information and adjust the expectation. Does that make sense? All right, emotional stressors, frustration, anger, disappointment. This can lead to meltdowns, okay? I've talked with a lot of caregivers, and the disappointment one seems to be a big one, right? Many kiddos who have autism and adults who have autism, they might struggle with communication and social interaction. And that can lead to increased anxiety and emotional overwhelm, right? And when they find it difficult to express their needs or understand others, that can build up and that can eventually lead to a meltdown, right? Maybe your kiddos haven't, got back to school coming up soon, right? And they're maybe have a hard time making friends, or they feel awkward, or they don't know what to talk about. And, maybe for the first week or two, they're doing okay. And then all of a sudden, week 3, they can't handle it anymore. And they've been trying to mask it. They've been trying to get it together, and it's building up. And then they just, second week of school and they're having a meltdown, right? This is why, okay, or it could be why. So when we acknowledge those challenges, those emotional challenges, and we provide that compassionate support and we communicate as effectively as we can, and we use those emotional regulation strategies, that can be very crucial in giving them a path towards recovery so they're not always in this up and down, okay? And they can kind of understand better what's going on in their bodies as well, which can be helpful, okay? So we want to work together to create effective prevention strategies that really support your kids' individual needs, okay? There's no, clear-cut 10-step program for this, right? It's so individualized because each person is experiencing it individually, right? So addressing sensory overload, maintaining consistent routines, and responding to stressors with empathy instead of frustration, we can help reduce the frequency and the intensity of meltdowns, okay? So next we're going to talk about how to prevent those meltdowns, okay? And how to establish routines and identify triggers to support everyone involved, okay? So de-escalation strategies, okay? So ideally we want to aim to prevent meltdowns and outbursts. The success rate of prevention is far greater than that of de-escalation, okay? So remember that chart from the beginning, right? If we can prevent the meltdowns, we can kind of catch it right as that trigger happens. We're going to prevent that meltdown, at least, to a greater degree, okay? So we want to prevent them because that de-escalation is usually just going to happen after it's run its course, and it's a lot more exhausting for everybody, okay? Sometimes it is unavoidable, of course, right? So it's important to know some effective de-escalation strategies. So some of these techniques may seem more like what not to do, and sometimes our own responses and emotions do make things worse, okay? So the first one, do not try to use reason or logic. Again, when your kiddo is having a meltdown, the logical part of their brain is not functioning. During the meltdown, that fight or flight instinct takes over and the brain is flooded with those stress hormones, and they literally cannot access the part of the brain that thinks logically, right? So course, it's always tempting to try and reason with your child, but often that just makes them angry. Okay, so we want to stop or want to avoid at least saying things like, I know you wanted me to pick you up from school, but I have to work late. Or your pink shirt is in the washer, so I can't have it ready in time, right? That's why I need to wear a different shirt, okay? When the brain's engaged in fight or flight, even though those reasons are logical and they make sense and they're unavoidable, and you're not lying to your kiddo or making things difficult to them, they're still going to perceive it as a threat. Reasoning attempts are ineffective, okay? And sometimes showing empathy can make things worse, strangely enough. So we want to focus on reassuring your child that they're safe by staying calm and meeting basic needs, okay? So once they have actually calmed down, they may respond to this kind of reasoning, but mid-meltdown, it's just not going to help, okay? So if you notice your kid being triggered by something, maybe the pink shirt thing, or I know you really want to wear that shirt and I'm going to get it clean, or whatever you need to say, and they may be more responsive to it. But if they've already kind of hit that acceleration peak and you're just like, well, I don't have it, I'm sorry, they're just not going to hear it. They're not going to hear the reasoning, okay? We want to avoid making demands, right? So sometimes making too many demands can cause a meltdown in the first place, especially if your child has what we call pathological demand avoidance, okay? But regardless of the cause, avoiding making more demands during dysregulated situations is going to be your key here, okay? Demands include telling your kiddo to stop, calm down, snap out of it, okay? That kind of stuff is not going to make them stop, calm down, or snap out of it, okay? It doesn't matter how nicely or how assertively you ask, okay? So we just want to kind of place all of our expectations on hold for a little while, okay? The only thing that matters in the present moment is helping your child to calm down, okay? Next, we don't want to yell to be heard over a screaming child, okay? Yelling makes you appear threatening and will not de-escalate a meltdown, okay? Once the fight or the flight instinct is activated, it's important to understand that your kiddo's brain, again, is perceiving threat. And they need reassurance that they're safe. That's really what it boils down to, okay? And you might be thinking, well, my kid knows that I'm never going to hurt them, right? Of course they know that. But during the situation, again, your kiddo isn't thinking logically at all. Their brain is instinctually reacting to something that seems threatening, okay? And if you then become threatening, that's just going to make it worse, okay? So if your child is screaming, don't try yelling so they can hear you. Wait until they stop and then speak to them calmly and empathetically, okay? Next one, and this is very important. We want to validate their feelings, not their actions, okay? Everybody has the right to feel a certain way about a situation that they're in, right? But one thing we don't want to do is shame your kiddo for how they're feeling, okay? A lot of our parents did that growing up and it never felt too great. And a lot of us are still trying to work through some of that, right? So we want to give validation to their feelings that shows their kiddos that we accept their thoughts, we accept their feelings, we accept their sensations, okay? And it also shows that we're on their side, right? Even if you don't think they have a reason to be upset, they obviously are upset. So we want to try to put ourselves in their shoes. We can say things like, it makes sense that you're mad right now. Or if that happened to me, I would also be upset, right? Include a because, the word because, when you validate instead of a but, because that's part of the strategy known as emotion coaching, okay? So for example, it makes sense that you're upset right now because you really wanted the orange cup, not the blue cup, right? And because it's hard to not get what you want sometimes, right? But when we use the word but, we're kind of injecting shame. It makes sense that you're upset right now, but you need to calm down, right? That's not going to make sense to them. It's just going to make them feel more shamed, okay? So we don't want to shame them for having emotions. We can learn a lot from the emotions. It's just the actions that maybe need to change, okay? So it's okay that you're disappointed. It's okay that you're frustrated. It's okay that you're upset. This is what we do with that feeling. We don't decide to throw things against the wall, right? Respect personal space, okay? Everyone has a bubble, and that bubble's different, right? But regardless, that bubble can get bigger with heightened emotions, okay? So unless your child asks, keep back at least 3 feet from them, right? We don't want to try to touch them, hug them, or pick them up unless, of course, they're in danger or they're asking you for it. But in a heightened emotional state like a meltdown, feeling like you're trapped or closed in can further escalate that situation, okay? Some kiddos want you to hold them, okay? I'm not saying don't do that if that's what works for your kiddo and that's what they want. But oftentimes when our kids are distressed, we immediately want to rush in and give them that physical comfort, but sometimes they're not in a space that they can receive that, okay? So use your best judgment. You know your kid better than anybody else, right? Be aware of your body, right? Language and facial expressions, okay? And you'll know exactly what I'm thinking because it's on my face, right? But we want to be aware when our kiddos are in this space where they feel activated and they feel threatened. We're not sitting there like scowling, okay, or crossing our arms or in a threatening posture, okay? We want to appear calm and non-threatening throughout the child's meltdown, okay? So the best way to do this, again, just be mindful of your body and your facial expressions. We want to keep ourselves neutral, facial expressions neutral. Consciously check yourself and make sure you're not frowning or furrowing your brow or clenching your jaw if you can. And be intentional with your body language, okay? Hands on the hips, arms crossed, all that stuff, pacing, pointing your finger, that's all reading as threatening to an activated nervous system. So one of the biggest factors in de-escalation is the emotional regulation of the caregiver, okay? So if they're freaking out and then you start freaking out, guess what? Now you're all just in one big freak out, right? Nobody's going to ride that ride very, very successfully, okay? Another thing, get on your child's level, right? If they're smaller than you, don't stand over them. Don't look down at them while they're talking. It gives off that superiority vibe, right? And that's not very helpful in the moment. And it can also feel very threatening, right? So if your kid will sit with them. If not, kneel so you're at eye level with them when you're communicating. Of course, in a full-blown meltdown, it's best to kind of keep your communication to a minimum. We're just trying to make sure that they're safe while they ride it out. And if they're on the floor, you might even just want to lay down with them, right? If that's what they're doing. We want to kind of get on their level. Again, we're not trying to rush to hold them or, make them feel like they're locked in, but we want to make sure that when we are communicating, when we can communicate with them, we're doing it in a way that, you're kind of like approaching like, a frightened animal, right? We want to be very cautious of how we look and how we're being perceived, okay? Another thing that can work if it's used early is distraction. So we want to try to distract our kiddo from the current situation. Maybe we offer them a favorite toy or we have a preferred calming activity that they really enjoy, right? Showing them a funny video that you think that they would like, right? Distraction can be very helpful. Maybe you want to suggest a short walk or offering your kiddo a break in a calm corner, right? If you have a space that's like, it's a very sensory safe space for them. Let's go sit in the calm corner, right? Let's see here. I also want you to know that the distraction technique doesn't mean that your kid's like getting away with poor behavior, okay, quote unquote. But once they're calm, they're more likely to respond with that reason and logic that we're looking for, okay? And we can readdress that original issue if it's appropriate. All right, and then the last strategy slide I'm going to share with you, reflecting on your child's wants and needs. So we can use something we call reflective listening that shows that you're listening to their concerns, even if they're not communicating them very well, okay? So we can say things like, so you're saying you're upset because you really wanted your pink shirt today. Or you don't want your aunt to pick you up from school. Do I have this right? Okay, you're reflecting back what they're communicating to you, okay? So if you're lucky enough and the child has a moment and they say yes to your reflection, then that opens an opportunity for you to validate their feelings and then to help them calm down, okay? Acknowledge your child's right for refusal. So children can suddenly become a lot more likely to cooperate when they don't feel like they're being forced to do something. And I know this is hard, especially for those of us who grew up way different, okay? We have patterns that we're trying to relearn as well, right? But again, if your kiddo has that pathological demand avoidance, letting them know, hey, you have a right to refuse, okay? You can say, you're right, I can't make you do X, Y, and Z, and then explain why you would like them to choose to do what is asked and provide logical consequences, okay? So for example, you're right, I can't make you clean up your toys. However, we can't play outside until they're put away. Okay, so you're allowed to set those boundaries. Okay, I'm not saying let your kiddos just run the household, but we also want to allow them to choose. Okay, so we want to keep in mind that the strategy is really only effective if you use it early. Okay, again, if your kiddo is in that activated like peak meltdown, you just got to let it ride out. Okay, you just have to white knuckle through it if you have to, right? Um, if your child's melting down, they're not going to respond to logical consequences. The next one, answer their questions, but ignore targeted aggression. So if your child asks questions during a meltdown, even if it's asked inappropriately or rudely, we want to provide a calm and concise answer. However, we want to ignore any aggressive statements they make towards you. So for example, if your child yells, "You're the worst mom in the world," okay, don't respond or react. Keep your talking to a minimum, using short responses, answer their questions, and nothing more. Okay. So if they accuse you of being the worst parent in the world, that is not the time to defend how they're wrong and pull out your 6-point thesis with citations as to why you're the best parent that ever existed. Okay. Which we all know that you are, but you can talk to them about that later. And then finally, silence. Sometimes total silence can help your child begin calming down, right? Especially if they're in sensory overload, you talking and having them try to, get that information and translate it can be even more overwhelming. So stop talking altogether to both your child and anyone else who's in the room. You can try to take those deep, slow breaths during this strategy to keep yourself calm. Even breathing deeply enough that it's audible in the silence, right? Because that can help to model that calm strategy, that healthy calming for your kiddos, right? If you start breathing deeply, they may start to kind of mimic you, right? And pick it up, right? Because they might not be ready to use a calming strategy, but they may follow your lead if you're engaging in one, okay? Just a few slides left. So speaking of regulation for caregivers, how do we do that? So caregivers and parents, they play a really important role because your kiddos look to you for emotional regulation and safety during difficult times, right? So it's crucial for you to be able to regulate your own emotions in order to regulate your kiddos. So some simple tips, take time for yourself, okay? There's a lot of in the moment strategies we can learn, but I think that making sure we're not entering a situation already kind of on the edge of our own capacity can go a long way in being able to stay calm when the kiddo starts to escalate. Because if you're right up here stress wise at the tipping point, and then your kid starts getting agitated and throwing up insults and telling you no and all that stuff, your parasympathetic or your sympathetic nervous system is going to start activating, right? And you're not going to start thinking logically. You're going to tip right over the edge, and you're just going to, you're going to be the parent you're trying to not be, right? So taking time for yourself, having time away from the kiddos, being alone or with other adults, whatever replenishes you, okay? Carve that time out each day, even if it's only 10 minutes, okay? Because you're trying to keep your levels at a manageable space, right? So that when your child inevitably blows their top, you're not already right at the edge of activation yourself, okay? Another one, prioritize those transition times like I was talking about before, okay? Your kids may act out the most during transition times, like bedtime, end of playtime, coming home from school. The transition from one task to the next can overstimulate the brain. Okay. And adults have difficulty with this too, right? I know for me, I get home from work and I spend, 35 to an hour by myself before I shift into mom mode, because I know that if I go right into mom mode, I'm going to be agitated, I'm going to be irritable, and I'm not going to be very nice. So I even have to take time for my transitions, and I'm a full grown adult. Okay. So kiddos definitely need to have that priority, that protection over the transition times. Okay. Especially if your kid is doing something that they enjoy and then you have to transition them into something they don't enjoy. Okay. Don't expect that immediately shift. Okay. You got to give them a little bit of time to accept their fate. Okay. So even making rules like for the first 30 minutes home from school or work, everyone has calm time. Okay. Whether that's alone or in the same room together, right? We just have that time to decompress. Breathing techniques can be very helpful, okay? Meditation can be very helpful. This can help reset the brain when we're feeling overwhelmed, okay? So the main focus on breathing is to just kind of hold your breath between the exhale and the inhale. Try to exhale a little longer than you inhale. So you kind of like breathe, like what I do is like I breathe in for 4, I hold for 2, I release for 6. That activates that other side of the nervous system, right? The parasympathetic one, the one that's more calm, okay? So we can find all kinds of techniques on YouTube, and there's a million apps and stuff like that. And I have a couple trainings on them, so we won't go into it too much here. But there's like a actual like physiological response that happens when we use those breathing techniques that gets us to that calmer space. Next, spend time having fun. Okay. Too often we move from one task to another and we really don't have a lot of time to enjoy our day and enjoy our kiddos, right? So reading a book, playing outside, having a family game night, right? Watch a movie together. These types of experience also promote healthy bonding within the family and with your kiddos, okay? So they know you're safe because you have a relationship with them. You go out and you have fun with them, right? It's not always tasks, it's not always discipline, and it's not always correction, right? And of course, exercise. This is really important in managing stress. It decreases anxiety and your risk of depression. According to the Mayo Clinic, exercise can make a statistically significant difference in improving anxiety and depressive symptoms. Why? Because it releases endorphins, which are those feel-good chemicals in our brain. So any exercise is good exercise, okay? Go at your own pace. I'm not saying you have to go out and, get the Tybo or the whatever's popular nowadays. I don't pay attention, but all the little gimmicky things that make you hurt for 4 days after you do it. I'm not saying you have to do all that, just whatever works for you, right? It could just be a walk, okay? It could just be a few stretches in the morning, okay? Start where you are and move from there. It's okay to have times when you feel overwhelmed, okay? And if you don't feel that your self-care routine is enough for you, it's okay to find a professional, right? A therapist, a counselor, a consultant, right? Many mental health providers offer virtual sessions like I do, okay? There's virtual support groups, there's Facebook groups, there's all kinds of places where you can kind of go and learn from each other when you feel overwhelmed, okay? Okay, so here is one skill called the stop skill. So this is a sequence that you follow, okay? So we stop, take a step back, observe, proceed mindfully, okay? So when we feel like our emotions are getting a little out of control, we want to stop, don't react. Don't move a muscle, literally just freeze, okay? Freezing for a moment helps prevent you from doing what your emotions want to do, okay? Which is often acting without thinking, okay? So this is how we can stay in control, right? We can name the emotion, put a label on it, and that can help us to navigate it, okay? Next, take a step back. So give yourself time to calm down and to think. Take a step back from the situation. Get unstuck from what's going on. Take a deep breath, right? We don't want to let our emotions control what we do. And we don't want to make split-second decisions if we can avoid it, right? We want to take our time and decide how to respond, okay? Next is observe what's happening within you, what's happening around you, who's involved. Listen to those automatic negative thoughts that kind of occur, and remember that those are just based on maybe outdated belief systems or the anxiety we're feeling or the stress, right? So we want to make effective choices by not jumping to conclusions, right? Saying, well, this is a good example would be if you stop, take a step back and observe what's actually going on with your child, you're more likely to understand that they're getting agitated because they're overwhelmed rather than they're being disobedient and they're being, fill in the blank, okay? So we want to be very aware of what's happening, okay? And then proceed mindfully, right? What do we want to make from the situation? What is the goal? What's going to make this better or worse, right? So our brain needs time to think all of this through. So we can use that stop skill. When we feel like we're about to react emotionally, we can take this stop skill take a beat, and then respond. Okay, that's the goal. All right. Some other skills, the opposite action skills. Okay, so all emotions activate us to respond to the type of activation that it's biologically wired to. Okay, so the opposite action skill allows us to choose to respond opposite from what our biological response would activate us to do. Okay, so some examples. Thirst can tell us that we need to hydrate, right? And that activates us to drink water. Hunger tells us that we need to give our body fuel, and that activates us to eat. Okay, so let's get into the emotions. Anger gets us ready to attack, right? It activates us to attack or defend. But the opposite would be to show kindness, walk away, show concern. Okay, shame can get us ready to hide, and it activates us to isolate. So the opposite would be to change our posture, raise our head up, give eye contact, shoulders back. Okay, this is the opposite biological response to what our body is wanting us to do. Fear can get us ready to run or hide. It activates us to escape danger. So the opposite would be to stay involved, build, act out of courage. Okay, now I'm not saying, go run into a lion's den if you're scared of lions. Okay, we're figuratively, there's some things we absolutely need to be afraid of. But if the fear response is causing us to kind of run away and escape danger, and there's not really any danger, the opposite would be kind of get curious, right? Stay involved in it. Depression gets us ready to be inactive, and it activates us to avoid contact, right? That withdrawal. So the opposite would be to get active. And then finally, the last example is disgust gets us ready to reject or distance ourselves, and it activates our avoidance. But the opposite would be to push through and get through the situation. Okay, so of course, as your children are learning these things, they may not be able to do the opposite action skill, but you as an adult can. Okay, especially like if you're dealing with anger, right? Your child's behavior is making you angry, right? And you feel activated to respond in that way. The opposite would be to show kindness. Okay, show that empathy, that concern, or even just to walk away, right? Course, if your kid's safe, you don't want to just, leave them in a Target, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. Okay, so what are the important takeaways? Okay, so as a caregiver, as a parent, there's some things that we would like to remember and take into account, especially for raising a kiddo who's neurodivergent and may spend more time with their stress response activated than their neurotypical peers. Okay, so we want to recognize the signs of overwhelm. Okay, so when the kiddo is stressed, their sympathetic nervous system activates. They're in preparation for fight or flight. Recognizing the signs of that activation can help you respond appropriately. Okay, so know your kiddo's early signs of stress. This will help you prevent meltdowns. Staying patient during dysregulation, right? During moments of high stress, your kid's ability to process information, communicate, respond logically is significantly reduced. Okay, being patient during this time is really, really key, because sometimes you just have to wait it out. Okay, and we have to understand that our kid has lost control, literally. Okay, wait for calm. Okay, it takes some time for the parasympathetic nervous system to kick in and to calm the body down after that stressor has kind of gone haywire. Let the body return to a state of calm. Co-regulation is very important. So the calmer you can be, the calmer they can be. Okay. The prefrontal cortex reactivates gradually. Okay. Just because their body is calm doesn't mean that their full functioning of their brain has come back online. Okay. That's why it can take a little while for them to get back to baseline. Okay. It could be a couple hours, it could be a couple days. So we want to adjust our expectations accordingly. Healthy gut, healthy mind. This is a good one. Pay attention to their gut health, right? Recognize the impact on mood and behavior. So if you notice that when your kid has, a little bit more sugar than they normally do, and their mood starts to kind of get wonky, be mindful of that, right? Make sure they're getting what they need so that their body and their systems can run as optimally as it can be, okay? Normalizing the experience. Help your child understand that the reactions are a normal part of how their body responds to stress, right? Teach them about the fight or flight response. And if you need help with that, let me know. Okay, I've had to teach all 5 of my kiddos about their bodies exactly for this reason. So when we understand how our bodies work, it can reduce the shame and help improve that regulation over time. And routine and predictability. Again, many kiddos with autism have having a structured home environment can help them feel safe. Unexpected events, changes, or uncertainty could cause a lot of stress for them, and it usually stems from them not having a full understanding of how the world works yet, okay? They don't understand why plans change. They're too little, okay? They don't understand why, they were going to go over to grandma's after work or after school, but then, grandma's not feeling well, so she's not going to have you over, right? Of course, older ones probably will, but the younger ones probably won't, okay? And then health and well-being overall, okay? Physical health, regular exercise, enough sleep. This strengthens the nervous system's resilience, okay? And it can potentially reduce the severity and the duration of stress response. So the main takeaway here is the meltdowns are not behavior issues. They are nervous system activations. It's a biological thing happening to your kid, okay? So if we can protect the biology of the nervous system, we're less likely to have moments where the stress is too much, okay? Again, everybody's different, but that's why being mindful of the environment your kiddos are in, being mindful of their triggers, being mindful of, the way that they're processing information can go a long way in these preventative strategies. All right, I'm a little bit over, I apologize, but that's the end of my information today. I'll go ahead and stop my recording and my share here.